apologise for the fact that between when we booked the room and now they've taken the ceiling down disconnected the lights. However, this is known as retrofitting. By the time it's finished, it'll be worse than when it started. Anyway, after those remarks, I welcome all the James McGill Society people to the Sigma's Eye series. And this is the second of our history lectures because Peter McNally gave the Christmas one on the history of the university and pointed out how important private finance was. And tonight we're going to have Professor Theo he is an expert in colloid and surface chemistry, both in fundamental aspects and applied to paper making and cellulosic materials. He has published over 330 papers in scientific literature, among them a book called Colloidal Hydrodynamics and several book chapters. Presently, he is full professor in the Department of Chemistry at McGill-University in Montreal and holds the Sir William C. Mcdonald Chair in Chemistry and a Senior NRC Innovations Industrial Research Chair. His major awards have been from the Chemical Society, for a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and the Carl Pulp Award in SCI from the Society of Chemical Industries in 2012. And without boring you any longer, Theo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony and Susan, to give me the occasion to talk about history. First of all, I have to admit this is the first time I talk about history in my life. So, I'm not an historian, and the history is probably not very rigid and rigorous, and it will probably have a personal flavor of how I see and remember things. But I hope you will bear with me. Okay, and what is remarkable this year is that Pulp and Paper now has a presence at McGill for a century. So this is really a centennial celebration of the activities of Pulp and Paper at McGill, which is, I think, quite unique and worth talking about. First, I want to acknowledge there are two books written on Pulp and Paper. One is Paprika, the First 50 Years by Sankey, and then by Peter Williamson's The Light in Their Eyes, which more or less covers the first 75 years. But they are not limited to McGill, they are related to the whole Pulp and Paper Research Institute. I will talk specifically to the history at McGill. I also want to thank my son who is here, who has been photographing and scanning pictures from these books and taking some other pictures, and Mohi Khan, who also has contributed to some pictures. Okay, so I wanted to divide my talks in a number of topics. First, the early events, starting in 1913, as I said. Then the creation of the Canadian Pulp and Paper Research Corporation, which became Pulp and Paper Research Institute of Canada in 1950. And then I will talk about the McGill Pulp and Paper Centre when the institute moved out to Point Claire, and some recent history and the present, and a few words about the future. So, the players which led up to this were the Canadian Pulp and Paper Association and the Forest Products Laboratory of Canada. I should say that the 1913s were a year of large optimism in pulp and paper. The barriers for selling wood to the States were lifted, and there was a large expectation that this was going to be a growing industry with a bright future. And so they decided they needed a lab, and that was the Forest Products Laboratory. And so the major event was the creation of the Forest Product Laboratory here at McGill, 1913. The director was Dr. Cameron, which you see here. And 2 years later, the creation of the Canadian Pulp and Paper Association Technical Section. And the founding chairman was John Bates, which you see here as well. And John Bates has been very long associated with the CPPA, and at the moment the highest distinction in pulp and paper in Canada is the John S. Bates Gold Medal. It's the highest distinction you can earn. 20 years later, there was another committee formed, the Committee of Technical Research, and that was chaired by Colonel Jones. And you can see by the title Colonel that he was in the war before, and he loved to be called Colonel instead of Dr. Jones.
Theo,
Do you think we could turn off the front lights? We can't see the pictures.
Can't see the pictures.
I think the only solution is to turn these off. That's our only either
Yeah, right.
on or off.
Those who don't, yeah, so you can go to sleep. Nobody will notice. I'm the only one who can't go to sleep. So here on top you see the laboratories of the Forest Products Laboratory. These were the house and stables of the Monson family, and it was called the Old Mill at 684 universities. That's a bit south of McGill. But all I've read about this, they always say it was associated with McGill, and I don't really know what the precise association was. Anyway, this was really not a very good building. It was unsafe. It was called the tumble down house with rat infested stables. And it didn't tumble down, but it burned down in May 1926. And the offices of the staff were located beside it in a much nicer building, which no longer exists.
So that's typical, wasn't it? The administration had the nice building,
Yes.
the workers had the devil.
Of course. So another major event is 1921. It was a bequest of $200,000 by E.B. Eddy to McGill for 4 years. They didn't know what to do with it, and then they decided that they would use it to set up a chair and a department of industrial and cellulose chemistry. And the first professor which was hired was Professor Harold Hibbert, and he got an amazingly large salary, $15,000 a year. And the typical, I looked up what the typical salary were of the other scientists at the Pulp and Paper Institute. They got something like $400 a month. So this is royally above the mean salary. Then there are lots of events where I just try to highlight the main ones. There was a memorandum of understanding between the Technical Research Committee, the Dominion government, and they formed a joint CPPA Forest Products Lab committee. So these two organizations became one. And then a year later there was an official proposal at the annual meeting of CPPA by Colonel Jones for the proposal for a new building. And this was approved by Sir Arthur Curry, and conveniently the old building burned down roughly at the same time. And the proposed location was 3420 University. The building committee raised $350,000 in mortgage bonds, and the Canadian Pulp and Paper Research Corporation was created that year, and it became a legal agreement between McGill, the CPPRC, CPPA and the Crown in 1927. So, here is Sir Arthur Curry. He was the principal at McGill at that time, and you see they dress up quite much more fancy than I do. This was the drawing of the building by Nobs and Hyde. Nobs is a famous architect here at McGill, and so this was the original design. As I will mention in a moment, it was not fully built according to plan. If you look carefully, the building is symmetric. This extends a little bit, and this extends a little bit, and this was never built according to this drawing. So, 1927, the laying of the cornerstone by the Minister of Finance, the Honourable James Robb, which I think is a very appropriate name for a Minister of Finance. Here you see the official opening, cornerstone ceremony, not the opening. So you have the President of CPPA, Colonel Jones, the Minister of Finance, the Principal of McGill, and then someone, I find a name, but I didn't know who he was, but he looks like a priest, so they probably needed some blessing for the opening. And then 2 years later, there was the official opening, and you recognize here Professor Hibbert, and there Cameron, who became the head of he was the head of the Forest Product Laboratory, became now the head of the new Pulp and Paper Corporation. So as I said, the building was not completed according to plan. They ran out of money, and what happens is that on the north side they just built a brick wall instead of completing the building to its original state. Now if you look very carefully, there's an annex on the back which still exists, And the annex extends further, and the annex was actually built till the main extension. So there was a kind of a strange way the annex was connected to the building. And you rarely see the building photographed from this side, because that's not the most picturesque part of the building. That's the only picture I could find where that site was shown. So we still have this inscription above the loading door of the Pulp and Paper building next door, which says Canadian Pulp and Paper Research Corporation. If I ask people what this means, nobody comes up with corporation. Most people guess center, so they have forgotten their history. Here's a very nice picture of it. I have a circle there because if you look very careful above this window, there is a little relief, and you can see it here. And most people I talk to have never seen this. They walk by every day and they've never seen this. And so this is some Indian chief, obviously is a leader, looks like a very wise person. And I am unable to find out why this was part of the Pulp and Paper Center. My best guess is that they wanted to have good relations with the Aboriginal people because they were going to walk and wanted to have the help of the local population. It's a very nice statue. I have something to do with this. In 1995, it lost half its face, and they wanted to take down this statue or this face, and I protested heavily. And as a result of my intervention, they repaired the original head. My contribution. Just to put it into context, at the same time, roughly in 1929, also in the United States, they created an institute of paper chemistry in Appleton, Wisconsin. And these two institutes, the center here at McGill and the one in Appleton, were the major drivers in the science of pulp and paper for many, many years. Notice that it's called the Center Institute of Paper Chemistry, was later renamed to the Institute of Paper Science and Technology. Chemistry was no longer enough. So here you see the entrance of the building, entrance hall. And these were the facilities when the building was originally built. So there was a private lab of the Eddy chair, then a whole number of labs, humidity room, a nitration room, a fireproof room, and then all kinds of normal things you would have in a lab. But I think interesting is that they want to play with explosions and chemicals. And I tell you in a moment how to what good use this was used. I'm a color chemist, and to my knowledge, this was the first colored lab in Canada, which was part of the Pulp and Paper building, which was built in 1927. And they had one of the labs colored laboratory. So it's quite unique. And physical chemistry, organic chemistry, the classroom. We still have occasionally Sigma Psi lectures in the same room next door in the Pulp and Paper building. And here you see Professor Hibbert addressing the students at the time. Library. There are lots of facilities in this building. And probably the most important was the experimental paper machine. Here you see one of the scientists inspecting the paper machine. And had lots of equipment. I just go through it quickly. Rod mills, digesters, screening systems, valley beaters, blow pit, a sheet former, grinders, and the beating room, the beater room. And there they beat pulp, and obviously not people. And so this is a historical picture of how it looked like in the early days.
Is that in the annex?
This is in the annex, yes. Okay, a bit about the administrative structure. As I said, Cameron was the first director, and in the postgraduate studies was Professor Harold Hibbert, who was in charge of the academic program here at the chemistry department at the Pulp and Paper building as well. Cameron died in 1930. He was succeeded by Dr. Bryant, and he died 1 year later, so they weren't really lucky with their directors. Then they got Jimmy Ross, and he wasn't much of a director. He spent all his time in the lab doing chemistry and causing explosions. I don't know exactly when he was replaced, but he was replaced by some. He didn't like to do any administrative work, filling in forms. So he was replaced by somebody who really liked filling in forms, duplicates, triplicates, you name it, and that was Dr. Johnson. I don't know exactly, I couldn't find precisely what time the transition took place. Then in 1940 they got the first director of the whole Canadian Pulp and Paper Research Corporation, and this was Professor Otto Maass. And in 1950 he was succeeded by Lincoln Thiesmeyer, or usually called Thies, but Otto Maass stayed in charge of the graduate study he was part of the corporation. And there you see a picture of Otto Maass. So I will show you a picture of Jimmy Ross. He was co-inventor of XRD, which is a power fuel explosive. I'm not precisely sure why they worked on this in those days, but everybody has his hobbies. This is Professor Dr. Thiesmeyer, and he really made the major change when he became the director in 1950. Before 1950, the corporation was a mixture of civil servants and scientists which were paid by the private industry. In 1950, when Thiesmeyer took over, the woodland sector, which I didn't talk about, were civil servants, and they moved out to Ottawa, where they still exist under the Canadian Forest Service. And from that time on, the corporation was funded solely by member companies, paper-making companies, and it became a fully a private institute, privately funded institute. Here you see another famous guy, Weldon. Another famous medal you can win at the CPPA sessions is the Weldon medal, named after that guy. And this was the first board meeting after the new structure has been set up. Some of the scientists, I don't name them all, but some of the more famous one, Campbell, he's very famous because he has an effect called after him, the Campbell effect. And those of you who heard me talk about a few years ago on the drying of paper, may have heard me talk about the Campbell effect and say that he was actually wrong, but that's okay. It created lots of discussions and created novel ideas. And Chapman was the printing expert at the center at the time. The postgraduate program, the major players were Professor Hibbert, Otto Maass, and a very famous technical specialist, George Tonderson. He later would become a co-inventor of the craft process, which made the craft process industrially possible. But while at McGill, he has a famous invention of making vanillin from lignin. And there's this famous patent in 1937. And for many years, and probably still almost to today, this was the only commercial products made from lignin, although most people claim you can make anything from lignin you want, except money. Some early technology which was developed in the Pulp and Paper Corporation. This is a very famous one, the Canadian Standard Freeness is a drainage test. You put pulp in a funnel, you put water in it, and it drains, and if it drains fast, then there's little overflow. And if it drains slow, there's lots of overflow, and you measure the overflow in milliliters. Now, knowing the Canadian freeness, one saved me from an enormous embarrassment. I was at a conference in Japan on polymer colloids, and there was an older professor who was a kind of a philosopher, and he talked about the difference in science between Japanese science and Western science, and one he called horizontal and the other vertical, and he associated this with the words freedom and freeness. And so when I gave my talk, I told more or less the people, well, Western science is not that vertical. Yeah, you go from one, you jump from one to the other, and you start somewhere else, and it's much more complicated. And I was severely punished for that. because during the dinner, the conference dinner, the chairman stood up and said, and now Professor Van der Ven is going to talk about freedom and freeness without any prior warning. And so I could start off by talking a few minutes about Canadian freeness, getting my wits together, and manage to give a speech on the topic. Other tests which were well invented at here, all kinds of tests. And then new staff arrived. The two most famous ones are Stanley Mason, and Professor Purvis, which became the new EB Edit chair after Hibbert retired. And this was Hibbert's retirement party in 1943. They had a buste made of him, and you see he's a smiling fellow. And all of his students put their signature on a very nice plaque, which is at the moment is here at McGill in the Pulp and Paper Center. And again, I had there some personal involvement. I don't know the history of this, but this ended up in the James River Company in the States in their library. And I got wind of the fact that they were closing down and closing the library. So I contacted them and said, McGill is a very good place for this to have. Could you please send this to McGill? And they did. Okay, war research. So during the war, more or less the whole effort here in the Pulp and Paper Center or corporation was diverted to the war effort. And look what they did. Chemical and biological warfare, here next door. Explosive, next door. I'll remember they had a nitration room and a fireproof room. Hydrogen peroxide, even Otto Maass worked on this. This was not to bleach chemicals like we do today, but this was to see if you could use it as a fuel or an explosive. And obviously specialty papers for the army. Army uses hundreds of different types of paper. And a very interesting one, which I did not see documented, but what I heard, I cannot imagine that wasn't not part of the effort here. This is pulp reinforced ice. Now this was a project which was supported all the way by Sir Winston Churchill and by the Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie. It was very secretive, and the idea was that if you compare frozen pulp, which is water and fibers, with ice, the pulp has very different properties. If you shoot a bullet at a piece of ice, it shatters and falls apart in 1,000 pieces. If you shoot a bullet into pulp reinforced ice, it just made a little crater and you capture the bullet in the material. And so they thought, we have this problem with the ships which go from Canada and the States to England, and they are shot down by the German U-boats. And the only way to fight this was with airplanes, but in those days they didn't have enough fuel they couldn't fly long enough to be useful. So they needed ships to land on, refuel, and continue. But these ships could also be torpedoed. So the idea was, can't we have kind of a floating iceberg and make it flat and make a landing strip and have these airplanes land, and then they can refuel and try to protect the ships again. So they actually started working on this, and they found that for whatever reason, having a solid ship was not really the best solution, so they went back to the concept of a hollow ship, which was made of ice, and they put tire on the outside to isolate it, and a big refrigerator inside to keep it cool. They actually built a prototype in Alberta, Lake Patricia, and it actually floated. But then they wanted to scale it up, and they got all kinds of problems. The ice would bulge, and then they had to reinforce it with steel, and then the whole concept got complicated, and they gave it up. So it was a big fiasco. But for about 3 years, they spent millions and millions of dollars to see if they could build ships from pulp. And the reason I think they were involved in this, this was done by the NRC, and the president of the NRC at that time was Otto Maass, Plus he was a director of a special branch of the Department of National Defense, so he must have been involved in this project. I also talked to Stan Mason about the effort in the war. But he never actually told me anything. He said he had sworn an oath that he couldn't talk about it, and he stuck to it. I think here's a very nice picture after the war, late 40s, where you see Otto Maass standing and all the scientists of the Pulp and Paper Research Corporation around the table. So, post-war. The center expanded, there were more people joining, both in chemistry and also in chemical engineering. And all of them really became very famous in their own field. Here's some pictures of Mason. In the middle you see Goring, expert in cellulose. Volker, also cellulose and polymer. This is Al Robertson, who was an expert in chemistry. Arthur Perling, which became the new EB professor after Purvis, and Jim Manley, who also joined during that time as well. So here you see some of the pictures of the engineer, Bill Govan, Dirk Atek. Dirk Atek was in mechanical pulping. Bill Govan was associated with Miranda and the paper company. And Murray Douglas, he's my guess this is a drying apparatus because I only know that he does drying research. Maybe it was just something else at that time, but I doubt. Okay, then, the major upheaval. The Pulp and Paper Research Corporation moved out of McGill, became far too big, took over the first the floor of the chemistry department, it had to rent other buildings, it became far too big, and they decided to create a new institute. And as I said, at the same time they had now changed their names, so now it was the Pulp and Paper Research Institute of Canada, and they moved to Point Claire. And they sold the Pulp and Paper building for $1 to McGill. Okay, this was done when Thiesmeyer took over. And it was decided that the academic research was to continue within McGill. Now, there's an interesting story here, because Thiesmeyer, he wanted to move everybody to Point Claire, including the academic research section. And Mason fought this very, very hard. He gave interviews in the radio, he contacted CEOs of paper companies, he got support of McGill, he wrote columns in newspapers, and eventually Mason kind of won the battle with Thiesmeyer, and they agreed to let the academic research continue at McGill. Had Thiesmeyer won this, then you could go now home yet, because then the history of pulp and paper at McGill would have been finished. Yeah, but Mason got his way, and he became at the same time then also the director of the center here at McGill. So then there was an enormous period of growth which lasted about 40 years. There are many new staff members, Derek Gray, Van Heiningen, Jules Garnier, QS, myself, Agaropoulos, Bob Marcheson, Kevin Surbite, and support staff, technician staff, Jean-François Revol, Louis Calbou, Bob Balinci. Roughly in 1928, the paper industry went belly up, major downturn. Pulp and Paper Institute had to lay down or downsize considerably and let many people go. And so there's a large effect on the center here at McGill. There are retirements and some post-retirements, which half of them died while they were post-retirement, so staying on is not a very healthy decision. And then some left for I guess greener pastures. Oops, wrong way. Now this is a very famous picture. At least I particularly like this picture. This is Stan Mason, this professor in civil engineering, Raymond Cox, And he's the most brilliant mathematician I've come across in my whole career. Absolutely brilliant. And I had the pleasure of almost daily talking to him during coffee breaks when I was a graduate student. And most of my thinking in the area of fluid mechanics is derived from discussion with Raymond Cox. And here's another theoretician, Dr. He. He was from Korea and also a very famous scientist. And as you can see from all the equations on the blackboard, they were discussing the deformation of particles in shear and electrical fields. And it actually has that phenomena has there's a number associated with it named after Mason. There's a so-called Mason number, which is the ratio of shear forces to electrical forces. And you can find now in many technical papers the term Mason number. When he came, he told me an interesting story. He came from Korea, and in Korea people are very polite. If you offer them something, they first say no, and then you have to repeat it, and finally they say yes, and everybody is happy. But he came here in a Canadian family, and they asked him, "Do you want potatoes?" He said no, he didn't get potatoes. He says it took him 2 weeks before he got anything to eat. Since he dared to say yes the first time. Here's a picture from the early 1980s when Robertson was the director of the center. So here you see Robertson, here's Mason, you see Goring, and some other famous people. I was less famous, you see me there with a beard all the way on top. I don't have a pointer here, but you can probably see where I am. And another one very famous person is there, Gray, with the large dark beard. So he became very famous indeed. And another maybe, what's his name again? He became quite well known in Domtar. I forgot his name. Okay, we'll come back to him. Okay, so the center directors, as I said, Mason became the director in '56. He retired in '79, but stayed on a post-retirement position. Al Robertson took over for about 5 years, then Derek Gray, and then me, and then there was nobody else to take over, so I got stuck with it, and I'm still in that position. And so you see here the 4 directors which, after the transfer from the Institute to Point Claire, have been directing the center. The Pulp and Paper Research Institute, which by then also became known as Paprikam, and this was initially a trade name, and it became known as Paprikam. There were 2 more institutes associated with it, the UBC Pulp and Paper Center and the Center of École Polytechnique, which were headed by Dick Kerkes and Jean Paris. And this led into a change in the structure of Paprikam, that there was now a director of academic affairs, which I reported to. And initially there was Henry Volker and then David Goring. And when David Goring retired, Dick and I said, we don't need a boss. So we told them we can do it together. And we abolished the position and one layer of administration. And we got a mandate to reform the Paprikam University funding system. Some of the activities during these booming years were the Applied Masters of Pulp and Paper, very successful program in the Department of Chemical Engineering with also chemists like myself and Derek Gray taught in that program, and many of Paprikam staff, and actually one of them, Don May, received the highest distinctions in the world in forest products in pulp and paper, which is the Max Wallenberg Prize, together with Mills from Point Claire in 1998. And I remember that this was, they worked on the refining of wood chips, and they had come up with new ways of refining and saving energy. And so this was reported in the Gazette at the time as they're in the chips, because you also get 200 or 300 something dollar cash. At the same time, and here's the ceremony with the King of Sweden handing out the prize. And this is still a yearly event taking place in Stockholm every year. We also had the applied master's program in papermaking chemistry, which I was leading, and this was set up by on request of Paprika's member company, because they said we get all these supplier companies, they're getting working us, they want to selling us all these chemicals, and we have nobody in the mill who can talk to them, we don't have the expertise. Can you set up a course and train people? So we did, and guess what happens? No paper company hired these people, they're all hired by the chemical company. Okay, big event, 1995. Still during the boom years, the building was extended, and in a rather strange way, because it was first extended to its original form. You see the little extension, and then something else was built to make it larger. And I don't know why they broke this symmetry. I was protesting at the time, but I was overruled by the architects. That the mandate they had to first put the building in the original form, and then we could extend it. So this was for political reason. But we got a very nice extension to the building. Here is the opening of unfortunately I couldn't find a better picture. I can't find the original anymore. But you see here the opening ceremony when the extension was ready. And you see Peter Rist, which was the president of Paprika at the time, David Johnson in the middle, and in between. And this is Minister Gagnon, who was the Minister of Education of Quebec at the time. And in between is, again the name escapes me at the moment, the governor of Quebec.
Greta Chamber.
Yes, yes, that's right. And so there you see the building, here you see one of the labs, and there I'm discussing with Pat McCaffrey, which was the administrator at the time, how we would like the thing to look like. A year later we got quite a large donation of equipment from Xerox. And again, Xerox decided to get out of papermaking. They decided that's no more part of their core business, and they had all kinds of papermaking equipment. So I went up straight to Xerox and negotiated that they would bring this to McGill. And my colleagues at the University of Toronto are still mad at me. And indeed, they donated this to McGill, and here was the opening ceremony of the papermaking mill. Wing is two representatives of Xerox. A major event in 1997. This was the first patent on nanocrystalline cellulose made out of wood, and this was by three researchers, Derek Gray, Louis Godbout, and Jean-François Revol. And this has become a major area of research. There's now a pilot facility which can produce a ton of NCC a day, although they haven't done it yet because there's no market for it. But it has lots of potential, and I think we will hear more and more of this. There's a major symposium in June solely on NCC. There are now hundreds and hundreds of researchers working in this area of NCC, including me, I should say, but that's besides the point. One of the activities in which McGill took place was an NCE, National Center of Excellence, in wood pulps. And the original objective was to solve the paper yellowing problem. And they were very successful. They solved the problem. But on the other hand, they were very unsuccessful because nobody wanted the solution. You had the newsprint manufacturers who didn't care that their newsprint was yellowing, so they were not interested in solving the yellowing problem. And then you had the fine paper manufacturers, their paper didn't yellow, so they were not interested in yellowing inhibition either. And so what was really needed is that you start making new grades, which is now actually at this moment is happening many, many years later, where you start using mechanical fibers for new products for which the yellowing inhibition is important. And the major spin-off is from that NCE's op test, and the president is here in the room, Laurent Trépanier, and the FQA, the fiber quality analyzer, came from the NCE, and from McGill, from Murray Douglas lab, came the formation tester. I believe it's called Paper Perfect, I'm not sure. Another major event is the Synergy Award for Innovation, and this was awarded to Paprika, McGill and UBC and École Polytechnique. And here you see this happy event where you have the characters, Dave McDonald, who was the VP of Paprika, Joe Wright, who was the president, Jean Paris, myself, and Tom Gustowski, who was the president of NSERC at the time. This picture is from the 90s. So this was taken when I was the director. You see all the famous people here. You see Derek Gray. You see how his color of his beard has changed from black to gray. Beside him is Gilles Garnier and Jim Manley. Here you have Dimitri Acharopoulos. Behind him Murray Douglas, Bob Polinci, George Cubis, myself. And see, so this was a large group of very active people at the time. And as you can see in front of the paper bill. Some recent events. 2002, establishment of 2 NSERC industrial research chairs, one in paper-making chemistry and one in cellulose chemistry for myself and Derek Gray. And then really a major upheaval. 2005 it started. The creation of the Canadian Forest Innovation Council. This was a council by the major player in the forest industry, in government, both federal and the provincial levels. They wanted to define the future directions. The major problem was that the industry was very divided. You had the forest industry, you had the wood industry, you had the pulp and paper industry, and they all had different demands on the government. And the government said, you've got to get your act together. And this committee was set up. And they came with more or less 2 recommendations. The first one was to combine Paprika, Ferric and Forentech in a single organization, which is now called FP Innovations. So Paprika, in a sense, ceased to exist at that time and became part of larger organizations. And that committee wrote 4 white papers. Well, if I say that committee wrote them, really 2 of the white papers were written by academics, but they claim to be in charge of it. And they formed the basis of new NSERC research, strategic research networks. And in 2009, as a result of this initiative, the government finally realized that the industry is going really only to survive if there is a major transformation going to happen. And they started to fund the forest industry to a large extent. And it was $40 million went to the Canadian Forest R&D Initiative. And that resulted in the creation of 4 new NSERC research networks. LignOWorks, obviously from the name, working on lignin, value chain optimization, which is the whole value chain, NewBuilds, which deals with new building materials, and the Green Fiber Network, which is led by myself here at McGill, to make novel products from fibers. And there were already 4 networks, existing networks, and they became part of this R&D initiative. So suddenly we had 8 research networks in Canada, which were all funded by the forest sector R&D initiative. So we decided to come together and organize ourselves, and we launched what we call FIBER. It stands for Forest Innovation by Research and Education, and it's a consortium of these 8 research networks, which I'm at the moment the chair of. And here you see all the research directors. Those of you who can still count, you see there are 9, not 8. And the reason is that one of the networks has 2 directors. It must be very complicated. Here's the official launch of Fiber in Ottawa, and all the representatives. This is Pierre Lapointe, the CEO of FP Innovations, You know how this is, and representatives of NRCan, FPAC, Forest Products Association of Canada, and ENSER. And this is our logo, which represents the 8 networks working together in a joint motion. Major event this year, no longer history. The NRC Synergy Award for Innovation went to Derek Gray, and here he's congratulated by David Johnson, who is no longer the principal of McGill, but now is the Governor General of Canada, and so he's back in the picture, congratulating one of our colleagues. And this is for the work on the nanocrystalline cellulose, which I mentioned earlier, the patent which came out in 1997. So that's 16 years since. So I would like to close with what's happening at the moment in the pulp and paper at McGill. And what has been happening is that there are very few people left who only work in the area of forest or pulp and paper. Now we have teams and networks, and people spend part of their expertise on problems related to wood, pulp, fibers, lignin. And so we have the 2 industrial research chairs, another 3 McGill researchers are part of the Green Fiber Network, so there are 5 of them in that network. There are 3 additional McGill professors working on nanocrystalline cellulose, 2 in chemistry, 1 in chemical engineering. There's working going on in molecular modeling with Professor Whitehead, who introduced me today. 2 researchers in Sentinel, or actually, well, 3, but 1 is also mentioned in the Green Fiber Network, so 2 additional ones. Professor Tufanci and Murray Douglas, 1 professor in LignoWorks, which is Bruce Aronson in chemistry. Work is going on dendrimers here in the chemistry department with Professor Kakar. The inking sludges by Professor Subhasis in environmental engineering. And there is an effort on the way in the biofuel net where Professor Lump and C.G. Lee are involved in applying their expertise to lignin. I think this will be the general structure of this research for quite a while to go, that there are very many problems which need an interdisciplinary approach, and you need many people from different disciplines to solve them, and so you have to get people together in teams, and so this is the new picture of how research is developing. It's no more people together in a single lab under a single roof, but people with similar interests coming together. And the common goal of all of this is obviously working towards an emerging bioeconomy. Eventually the fuel is running out of fossil fuels, although in Canada we may still have enough for a century, if you believe my colleagues in Alberta. But globally we clearly have to become less reliant on fossil fuels, and so becoming reliant on renewable biomaterial will be a major asset, and I think that will be the theme for the next 20 years probably to come, where research will be done, including here at McGill. And so this is my short summary of the 100-year history of pulp and paper, and I thank you for your attention.